Hi, Betsy.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. I'm Sarah Posner. This is the Posner Show. And back with me today is Betsy Woodruff, the Buckley Fellow at the National Review. And we're going to talk about all things politics today. We're going to talk about the start of the GOP primary for the presidential nomination in Iowa this weekend. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in state houses around the country, and in particular, Texas and North Carolina that have been in the news a lot recently, particularly in Texas over the the bill restricting access to abortion there. And I know that you went down to Texas and you covered the hearings on the bill. I think the ones after, were you there for the Wendy Davis filibuster, or were you there after they had the new session?
Right, I was there for the second special session.
Okay.
And Davis's filibuster, the way it worked was that it ran out of time in the first special session.
Right. So what was your sense? I mean, obviously the bill passed, but also obviously there was a lot of pro-choice activism around that, spurred in part by, or in large part by, Davis's filibuster. Did you get the sense that the pro-choice movement is making a comeback in this deeply red, deeply pro-life state?
You know, it's hard to say because on a pure optics level, there's kind of two ways of looking at it. One way is that there was an enormous number of protesters in Austin during the entire thing, very well organized. Basically, every major media event, every major hearing or vote, there were lots and lots of protesters. Part of that's helped by the fact that the capital is Austin, which tends to be more liberal than the rest of the state. For instance, if the capital had been maybe Dallas or Fort Worth, it's possible the protesters wouldn't have showed out in as great of numbers. But on the one hand, I think it's easy to look at just that appearance, and also to look at the energy that Davis has generated and say, you know, if I was a pro-choice person in Texas, despite despite the fact that ultimately Davis's contingent lost, it looks good. Now, the alternative reading of this, and I'm not sure which I described too, is that there was a decent amount of controversy, I think, surrounding the pro-choice protesters. You have the issues with tampons getting confiscated because allegedly security people were worried they were going to be throwing them at legislators when they were leaving the chamber. You have some signs that were fairly controversial. I think you also have the fact that having pro-choice people be this visible, it could end up just being more galvanizing to pro-life protesters in Texas who might have been sort of taking for granted the fact that Texas is such a red and such a pro-life state. So I think it's tricky. I think maybe the most interesting indicator will be Wendy Davis's re-election bid, which I believe is in 2014. She has a pro-life Tea Party challenger, Connie Burton, and Burton's gotten a decent amount of buzz in Austin. And I've heard some people theorize that maybe Davis is more liberal than her district is. On the other hand, she raised about $1 million since the filibuster.
Right.
So it's tricky. I think it's probably too soon to say who's won in terms of the next 5 years. But I imagine that big picture, the amount of protesting and activism that happened would be heartening to members of the pro-choice movement.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that even though people in the pro-choice movement clearly knew that ultimately, notwithstanding the filibuster, this bill was going to pass, there's going to be a legal challenge to the bill, obviously. Right. But I think that it was extremely galvanizing in a way that I think we haven't seen in a long time. I think that for pro-choicers, this Texas bill was a little bit of in all the states, not in all the states, in many states, in all the states that are passing bills to restrict access to abortion, I think that each one has been a little bit of a pile-on for pro-choice activists, and they're looking at the landscape, and they're looking at the geography of where women can still access abortions in the various states. And I think that the way this Texas bill was, not only the substance of it, but the way that it was proposed and the way the whole thing played out, and in addition, the obvious presidential ambitions of Rick Perry, tied in with all of this. I think that combined with just the sheer guts and endurance of Wendy Davis's filibuster was very motivating and encouraging and inspiring in a way that I haven't seen in a long time. So obviously they've lost in the short term because the bill passed, but I think that I think it has the potential to change, maybe not to change the conversation about abortion, but to maybe change the activism around abortion. Although I think that it definitely remains to be seen, but I think it has that potential.
I think regardless, this is a really important moment, and in 5 years, if Texas is turning more purple, which could be happening based on demographics, or if it's pretty much stayed rigidly as red as it was, I think this is a line in the sand, if you will. One thing I think that's important to bear in mind, though, when talking about how this is a loss for the pro-choice movement, in the short term at least, is that another area where, and I think this hasn't been emphasized enough, where pro-choice members of the legislature lost, is that they didn't get the legislation amended. I talked to one lobbyist who said that the number of pro-life legislators who showed up on the day of the House vote could have been significant. On the day of the House vote, the gallery was basically all blue, which is the color pro-life protesters wore. And that was unusual, given that over the course of most of the votes, it was predominantly orange. But there was a lot of pro-life activity. And, when the House voted on this legislation, there were more than 24 proposed amendments, ranging from stopping the death penalty to allowing exceptions for abortions in the case of rape and incest after 20 weeks. And one Republican who's pro-choice, was pushing for some of these amendments, and none of them went through. And the person that I spoke with theorized that if there hadn't been any pro-life presence, or if there hadn't at least been any sort of pro-life backlash or response, if you will, it's possible the bill would have been amended, and it's possible Republicans would have capitulated, made it a little bit softer, made it slightly less pro-life, if you will. So the fact that the bill didn't get changed, I think, is something that Republicans at Austin are seeing as a win for them.
But I guess again, in another sphere, it could be seen as beneficial maybe to the pro-choice side, because the harsher the bill, perhaps it's easier to mount a legal challenge against it.
True. Yeah.
So so let's, I've a couple years ago, I reported a story on the pro-life movement in Texas, and I was, having been there and done this reporting and talked to all these activists there, and I was surprised to even see the whole Davis filibuster thing happen, because my sense there was that the anti-abortion forces in Texas were so entrenched and intense and powerful. It was kind of amazing to me, having seen that firsthand, and how close they are with Perry and with a number of influential Republican legislators there. It was an interesting story for me to watch from afar, having been there a couple years ago. But so let's, so some people, there's been some talk about, obviously Rick Perry not running for governor again, and whether that means he's going to try to run for president again, which caused, I think, a lot of guffawing given his performance in 2012. I still wouldn't underestimate him, making a comeback, but I think it's a little bit doubtful. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, what I've heard is that there's a sense that Perry sort of wants another chance to kind of redeem himself on a national scale. People tell me that the underreported story of his 2012 bid was the extent to which the painkillers that he was on for back surgery really limited his ability to campaign effectively. That's not something I've been able to corroborate independently, but I do think there's a sense in which people argue this guy was in a lot of physical pain. He was taking some pretty heavy medications, and unfortunately that coincided with a debate that didn't go so well. But
then there was that weird speech in New Hampshire where people thought he seemed drunk, and
where he's holding the bottle of maple syrup upside down and stuff, and it's just very baffling. So I think people are theorizing that Perry just kind of wants to sort of redeem himself, show that he's a serious politician.
So people don't remember him as first, second, third. Right.
Right, exactly. Which is understandable, and if that's your national legacy, it's kind of a downer. So I think that's probably the best argument for Perry wanting to run nationally. Now, there's only room for so many pro-life, ultra-conservative Texans in the 2016 bid.
Right.
A gentleman whose name may come to mind could be sucking a little bit of the oxygen out of the room. But I think Perry's supporters are cautiously optimistic about his chances. And if he decides, it's not going to surprise me either way. He's not a super predictable politician, but right now it's looking like he's leaning towards a presidential run. And he just rehired Mark Minor as sort of a political advisor of sorts, which a lot of people see as an indication that he has national ambitions.
So I guess the question that comes to my mind is, I don't know how well his pressing of these abortion restricting bills as governor of Texas would benefit him. Obviously, they would benefit him in the GOP primary, but they would not be a plus, I don't think, in a general election, which makes me wonder, I wonder whether he's running to win the nomination, or running, like you say, to rehabilitate his image. And he doesn't necessarily hold out that much hope of either winning the nomination or after that winning a general election. But the idea is to rehabilitate his image among GOP primary voters, or just the party in general after 2012.
Yes. Yeah. So if the theoretical question is, assuming Perry wins the nomination, which is probably not where the smart money's at, but assuming he does and he becomes the GOP nominee, does his work on the pro-life legislation in Texas, does that help or hinder him? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a conservative case to be made, or at least a case to be made, that the bill might not necessarily hurt him that much. It's 20 weeks. I don't know what the latest polling data is on how Americans feel about abortions after 20 weeks, but it's not like it's 6 weeks or something. And assuming that
which is being tried in somewhere.
I'm sorry?
That is being tried in another state.
It might be, yeah. I wouldn't, yeah. And then tightening restrictions on abortion clinics. I imagine that's the kind of pro-life legislation that would play all right. It's not a super tight ban, assuming Perry doesn't pull an Aiken or anything. I don't think this is the kind of legislation that would kill somebody among moderate voters. Now, has Perry said and done other things that would maybe not help his appeal to swing voters in the suburbs of Toledo? Yeah, if there's a picture of you waving a pistol over your head, that could make for some interesting oppo ads. But I'm not convinced that if he becomes the nominee, his support for this pro-life legislation will be a problem.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know that I agree with that. I think that, given his stated goal, his unmistakable goal is ultimately to have abortion be illegal entirely. Mm-hmm. And so I think that if a voter could be persuaded by Perry's opponent or by third parties that this is one step in that ultimate goal, I think that just looking at the legislation itself in a vacuum would not, that the voter wouldn't look at the legislation in a vacuum. They would look at it in terms of what his ultimate goal is there.
That's true. Yeah.
But
and the question there is, to what extent is the abortion issue a deciding factor for the American electorate in 2016?
Right, and I think that polling shows that it's more of a deciding factor for people who are opposed to abortion than it is for people who support legal abortion, because I just think that there's a discrepancy between the intensity factor and also the factor of is this issue enough to, is this the issue, the deal breaker issue for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I think that it's more of the deal breaker issue for the anti-abortion voter, statistically speaking.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. But I wonder if that's going to change. I mean, I just wonder whether the more the state legislatures are passing these bills, the more it could make somebody who might have in the past been, pro-choice, but not necessarily moved so much on the issue in a general election, change their mind about that. Whether, to someone who had been maybe complacent about abortion remaining legal, whether now these more restrictive bills might make some voters be more intense about it.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I haven't seen any polling data on that, so I have no idea.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that's something.
I haven't either. I know Emily's List has been emphasizing a lot what's going on in state houses.
Right, right.
Yeah, if you look at how they're approaching this issue, it's very much the sense that I get is trying to communicate that abortion rights aren't guaranteed, abortion access isn't guaranteed, and that pro-choice voters who don't make it a single issue maybe should be leaning in that direction. Mm-hmm. And I think for pro-life candidates or pro-life politicians, that's probably something that's heartening. I imagine Rick Perry's pretty pumped when he sees an Emily's List fundraising email that says there's not going to be any more abortion in Texas. That would be an indicator, I think, to pro-life people that they're doing something right. And you're right. It depends on how this all just pans out over the next 2 years or so.
But the reality is the Republican Party is not going to nominate a presidential candidate who's pro-choice.
Right.
I mean, it will be a fight at the margins, right? So mm-hmm. It'll be, they'll try to outdo each other in terms of proving how pro-life they are. So there might be some marginal differences, I think, between them. But in the main, I don't think that there's going to be a huge discrepancy in their views on this.
And at the same time, Romney supported abortion in the case of, I think, rape and life of the mother.
That's where I think that the margin.
So he wasn't the most pro-life candidate in the Republican.
But he definitely tried to fudge on that. I mean, depending on what audience he was speaking to.
Yeah, that's true.
So while we're talking about Texas politicians, we are already talking about Republican presidential hopefuls going to Iowa. And it's more than 2 years, right? So 2013, so we're more than 2 years away from the meaningless Iowa straw poll. And we're already...
Wait, are you saying Michelle Bachmann isn't president? But she won the AIM straw poll.
Right. Yes, exactly. So, I rest my case. So of course Cruz went to Iowa this weekend and then promptly went on one of the Sunday talk shows and said that he hadn't been thinking about, the 2016 campaign at all. Of course not.
Yeah.
He just went to Iowa because it's so beautiful there in the summertime. So there's been some talk about Rand Paul, who was also in Iowa this weekend, speaking at the same event as Cruz. And, but I think that lately there's been an intense focus on Cruz, and I'm not really sure why. I mean, I think that they're both they're sort of similarly positioned in terms of being, relatively new to the Senate, both being Tea Party favorites, but perhaps in slightly different ways. Mm-hmm. I think Rand Paul is more the successor to his father's movement, whereas Cruz, I think, might represent more of a different piece of the Tea Party. But there's been a lot of talk about Cruz in the last week or so. There was, I don't know if you saw Rich Yesselsen's piece in Politico talking about how Cruz sort of embodies where the Republican Party is right now, and he did not mean that in a flattering way. And then, so then that generated some talk of, well, Democrats should hope that Cruz wins the nomination because, of course, he would be so easy to beat because he's so out on the fringe of the Republican Party. And then Jonathan Bernstein had a piece in Salon that said, whoa, Ted Cruz could win a general election, so Democrats shouldn't get all complacent about that. And then your colleague, Robert Costa, was out in Iowa this weekend with both of the candidates and reported from the pastor's policy briefing that both of them spoke at. Which was, an event that's it's so pastors can hear the candidates speak and then go back to their congregations and maybe not necessarily endorse one candidate over the other, although I'm sure that happens. But it's more of a kind of evangelical get out the vote sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of that get out of the vote process is making sure that these candidates have, solid conservative Christian bona fides. I imagine part of what Ronnie struggled with was that making friends with pastors in Iowa would always be a little bit trickier for him. But it seems like, from what I've read, both Paul and Cruz passed with flying colors in terms of solidifying that. Yeah.
Right. So let's talk about Cruz for a minute. So, how do you see him? Do you think he's on the really right fringe flank of the Republican Party, or is he sort of just pretty much where the GOP is right now? Not the GOP in Iowa. I don't mean that. I just mean generally.
Yeah. Kind of. It's a little tricky to answer that. I think what Cruz wants in terms of policy is probably not super fringy within the GOP, but I think his methods would seem more, eyebrow raising. I think this weekend he talked about how the federal government shouldn't be funded unless Obamacare is defunded, which is not something that I imagine Eric Cantor and John Boehner are super excited about. Cruz has obviously been very out front in opposing the Gang of 8 immigration bill, but even that isn't really a quote unquote fringy take within conservative circles. The GOP is very divided on that. Mm-hmm. I think what makes Cruz less palatable or more concerning to progressives is probably more his rhetoric than the policy stances that he has. I mean, in some ways, Rand Paul is more fringy than Ted Cruz. You look at foreign policy, you look at the way he approaches international relations, and that's much more outside the norm for the GOP than I think Cruz is. But Cruz, is very bombastic, has a very high comfort level with getting the base excited, all about getting rid of the IRS, and I think that's probably where it he's painted himself as maybe more far conservative, arch conservative than say any Republican senator whose name he pulled out of the hat.
I think it's the policy, but it's also the approach. It's the sort of statements like Harvard Law School is crawling with communists, and that explains a lot about Obama. And he has, I think, to some people, he has some cred on that because Cruz actually went to Harvard Law School. But for people who know anything about Harvard Law School, it's sort of kind of laughable, the idea that it's crawling with communists. So I think it's a combination of his policy stances, which, as you say, I think are they're not really outside the mainstream of the GOP right now. I mean, like you say, on the immigration bill, that opposing the immigration bill is not really on the outside of the Republican Party. But I think that some of the rhetoric he uses and the idea that he would deploy that rhetoric in a political setting, like a Senate hearing or in the context of some kind of investigation, Benghazi, IRS, whatever, I think that positions him not just rhetorically, but I think it says something about what his policy positions are in a way that I think not every Republican would be so upfront with, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so he went, they both of them went to this pastor's policy briefing, which these pastor's policy briefings, they date back years and years and years. in Costa's piece, he talked about David Lane, who is the activist who organized or has been organizing these. I think that they originated actually in California with a California restoration project years ago. And then there was a Texas restoration project. They sometimes call them restoration projects. Sometimes they call it the Renewal project. I think in Iowa it's called the Iowa Renewal Project. And David Lane was also, active in the Texas one, which was also played a role in getting Rick Perry elected governor. So these are gatherings that the premise of them is to, help promote or restore America to its Christian roots, and also to engage clergy in the electoral process, even so early in the game. It's definitely aimed at getting pastors involved and thinking about who the candidates are and vetting them, so to speak, for evangelical voters in Iowa.
Yeah, I think so too. Vetting candidates and also working on galvanizing the evangelical base so that they'll show up and vote, which is obviously 51% of Republican primary voters in 2012, I think, were evangelicals. Is that right?
I don't remember what the number is, but in Iowa it's very high. In Iowa in particular, it's very high.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is interesting, given that Iowa isn't a super red state. Harkin's one of the more liberal Democratic senators. It's always in play in presidential elections, but the Iowa base is maybe one of the most conservative bases. So especially of the early states,
right? Which leads to the perennial question: why does it, get to play such a significant role in the primary process? Of course, in 2012, Mitt Romney did not do well there, but moved on to win the nomination. So maybe. But it gets a lot of the focus, obviously, early on, especially now, because you have these candidates like Cruz and Paul who are going out there now to try to appeal to this part of the base. And, most of the country has no idea who Bob Vanderplaats or Steve Deese are.
Right, yeah.
Right, so these are the supposed kingmakers in Iowa who play a significant role in assessing the candidates and conveying to the base what they think of the candidates. And I think that there's sort of they play an outsized role to reporters who cover campaigns relative to what your average voter in other states has, relative to their knowledge of or their recognizability to voters in other states.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about Cruz and talking to these pastors. He is very comfortable, I think much more so than Rand Paul is. So Rand Paul, basically said, I went and talked to these pastors, and my faith is very important to me, and it informs my worldview. These are, rhetorical things that he can say to make them feel comfortable with him and feel confident that he's a true Christian. But, he's basically saying, I don't wear it on my sleeve. Cruz, it sounds like, definitely was wearing it on his sleeve in a big way.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting contrast between the two of them. And I think maybe that's sort of one small example of just their personality and their approach differences. Even if you looked at the way the two of them were talking during Rand Paul's filibuster, when Paul is very passionate, very obviously emotionally involved in what he was saying. Even then, Cruz comes down and reads Travis Austin's letter, and it feels even more bombastic, over the top, even a little bit theatrical. Pastor wrote that Rand Paul stayed behind the podium, read from notes, while Cruz gets out from behind it. Or Rand Paul read from a text while Cruz only uses notes. And then you look at the fact that Paul maybe isn't going to be talking about his testimony all the time, but Cruz has a very high comfort level talking about his personal faith. And I would assume that's an advantage for Cruz in these circles, within evangelical circles. It seems like there's a pretty high trust level that candidates aren't making this stuff up, and that they aren't getting played. You look at George W. Bush. I don't think he ever really lost the loyalty of his evangelical base, because people took his conversion story very seriously. And I imagine that's probably something that was a liability for Romney, because that's just a narrative that he couldn't really use in reaching out to these voters. And if Cruz is able to use it effectively, that's a big advantage for him.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I mean, he is. I've seen him talk religiously, or and he's very. It seems very comfortable to him for him. It does not. You don't feel like, oh, he's just citing this Bible verse because he's running for office. I mean, obviously he is, right? But I mean, a lot of candidates, it's more of a stumble, or more of it seems like a strain on them to talk in that way. For him, it seems like, this is what I do. Mm-hmm. It's very, and it sounds like from the coverage that the pastors were very receptive to it.
Yeah, for sure. And I couldn't tell if they were necessarily more receptive to Cruz than Paul, although I think Costa's analysis was that Cruz maybe won the weekend. But yeah, right. This is stuff that goes over really well.
Did you read any? I think you read another coverage in another magazine of Cruz's performance there.
In a Pentecostal publication. I think it's Pentecostal, and yeah, it was very much. They talked about pastors laying hands on both candidates and praying for them after they finished their speeches. I think at one point Cruz got a standing ovation when he talked about abolishing the IRS. Just had tons of applause, tons of audience response during his speech. So, I mean, yeah, all this stuff that Cruz does that I think a lot of people in the Beltway find maybe off-putting or over the top or a little bit dramatic. Yeah, it's you underestimate the appeal of that to Republican primary voters at your own peril. Like, this is stuff that goes over well, plays well.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I find the whole Rand Paul story with evangelical voters really interesting, because I think that in 2008, Ron Paul, he was just kind of like, you know what, I'm not going to pander. I'm just going to be me. And this is where I am. And I'm a Christian, and I go to church, and that's pretty much all I'm going to say on the topic. And then in 2012, he hired the Bush's old evangelical outreach person, Doug Weed, to help him with evangelical outreach in Iowa and in other states. And, that was really interesting, because he still was saying, I'm not going to pander and I'm not going to wear my religion on my sleeve. But the campaign still worked hard at getting pastors and evangelical figures to endorse him. They made much more of an effort to sell him to evangelical voters in that way, that, you should feel comfortable with him. You should feel confident that he, that he's a Christian like you, and that he's on the same side as you on these issues, and that he's a true believer. And, it worked. I think that it had a little bit more effectiveness maybe than he had in 2008, but, it seemed like he never really bored into that core, that sort of like what I'll call the mainstream core of the evangelical base of the Republican Party. He sort of never became that guy.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
And it seems like Rand Paul's trying to fix that for himself. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wonder how much of that is a tricky balance for them, given that the Paul's libertarian base is probably a lot less comfortable with religious language, biblical rhetoric, testimony, stories, etc. You think about sort of your stereotypical Rand Paul supporter, and you don't imagine a person who's necessarily religiously devout. I think that's something that's a balance that will be tricky for Paul to navigate as he's looking at 2016 bid, is just that reaching out to conservative evangelicals, and also reaching out to more libertarian liberty movement young people is tricky. And the kind of people who get really worried about drone strikes, the kind of people, I'm speaking in huge generalities here, but
Right.
you know, like the drone strike voting bloc is also, you know, it's a separation of church and state, right? You know, freedom of religion. And
Yeah, I guess I wonder how much those issues matter that much. So, like, if he has already, to those kinds of voters, so if he's already proved his cred to them on drone strikes, for example, can he now move on to proving his cred to another piece of his constituency that he needs to win over? You know what I mean? I wonder, like, will it be the sort of thing where they're like, okay, well, maybe he has to do that to win, and we're not crazy about it or anything, but we're not so doctrinaire about it that we're going to turn our back on him if he also tries to reach these evangelical voters. I don't know.
True. That's true. And the fact that Rand Paul is pretty unabashedly pro-life, I think, would, and still has support from, for lack of a better term, the drone strike voting bloc, I think would, if that's okay. I think that would
the anti-drone strike voting bloc, more accurately, right?
right. The anti-drone strike. The drone strike voting bloc is a very different group of people.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a good news for him. It's just, you know, a question of how he manages to balance it. And I think another thing that's tricky is that, you know, when we look at these young libertarian voters and you contrast that base with the evangelical base, you know, one difference here is that I think libertarian voters are you know, they're less organized. They don't have the clear leaders, at least I don't sense they do the same way that evangelicals do. And they're probably more likely to abandon a candidate if that candidate seems like a squish or not like a true believer on this libertarian stuff. Whereas with evangelical voters, the sense that I get is that the most socially conservative candidate, they're good, you know, and it's, are you pro-life? Are you against gay marriage? And if you are, you can get away with a lot, which we saw with George W. Bush. That might not necessarily be construed as conservative. So I think that's probably a tricky element of this for Rand Paul. And then also I think that the size and effectiveness of the libertarian voting bloc is still kind of a question mark. You know, we don't know how effective libertarians are going to be on these issues. There's a joke. How many libertarians does it take to change a light bulb? None. They never change anything. and you know, it remains to be seen if that's going to happen. I think libertarians recognize that Rand Paul is their best chance at actually making for significant policy change. And you know, the question is how much they'll let him reach out to non-libertarians without starting to abandon him.
Yeah, I guess I also wonder whether I feel like there's crossover. So you have the libertarians who are pretty much not interested in the religious issues or the religious outreach. They're just interested in small government and et cetera. But I do think that there's like a constituency that, you know, if you made a Venn diagram of it, there are people that maybe they don't self-identify as a libertarian, but I think that there are people who would classify them as a libertarian because, you know, a very big part of the social conservative message is also that government should perform a minimal role and be small. And so I think some people might consider that to be a libertarian idea, but they mesh it with, you know, abortion bans and, you know, high religiosity in politics and government, which is not really a libertarian idea. But I just wonder whether what Paul is aiming for is like the middle of that Venn diagram, you know, so if he can keep the sort of non-religious libertarians by getting that sweet spot for the social conservatives and not talking too much about, you know, abortion and same-sex marriage and all of that. I just wonder if that's kind of where the space where he's hoping to capitalize.
Yeah, and that's a tricky line to navigate, sort of courting socially conservative libertarians. I think in the upcountry of South Carolina, there's a lot of that brand of Republican. And at the South Carolina State Convention that I went to, I guess, in maybe March, a couple months ago, there was like this movement to primary Lindsey Graham, and they tried to use parliamentary tactics and stuff to get him pushed out, and it didn't work. But that contingent of voters is definitely a presence. I think the question is, how big of a presence are they, and are they going to demand so much ideological purity from their candidates that their candidates will never be able to really seriously court, voters in Northern Virginia or suburbs of Ohio? That's just what's tricky. I mean, Lindsey Graham is probably not going to get primaried, and if he gets a primary contender, he's probably going to be okay. Because it's hard for these groups to be very effective. Like, they're kind of unproven. Maybe it will be. It'd be interesting to watch.
Well, there's also the money factor, and somebody who's been an incumbent so long has access to donors that insurgent candidates don't. So, yeah, that's a big factor, and the name recognition.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks for talking about all this stuff today. I'm sure we'll be back in this same spot talking about Ted Cruz and Rand Paul and Rick Perry and Chris Christie and Jeb Bush.
All that good stuff.
So we complain that we talked too early about presidential primaries, and here we are.
It happens. What are you going to do?
All right. Thanks, Betsy.
All right. Thanks, Sarah.